She stood frozen, her breath caught between grief and horror, as the shovel struck the earth again and again. Each sound was a countdown, each thud a reminder that she was powerless. In front of her, a grave was carved into the soil, not for a stranger, but for her own son. The night whispered secrets of betrayal, and the mother could do nothing but watch, her heart breaking with every stolen breath of the boy she brought into this world. Evelyn sat in the stillness of the night, her breath sharp in her throat as the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil and the metallic temps of fear. It was not the kind of fear that comes suddenly, like a startled gasp in the dark, but the kind that builds quietly, steadily, until it becomes a suffocating presence you can't shake. She knew something was about to happen, something irreversible, but no prayer or desperate thought could prepare her for the horror that was unfolding before her eyes. Her son, Michael, stood a few feet away, bound and trembling, his face pale beneath the thin wash of moonlight. His lips quivered, whispering fragments of words she couldn't fully hear, but she knew what they were: pleas, apologies, promises he would never get the chance to keep. She wanted to run to him, to shield him the way she had when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms, when he used to crawl into her bed and bury his face against her chest, seeking warmth and comfort. But now, her body betrayed her. Her arms felt like stone, her legs rooted deep into the earth, forcing her into the role of a silent witness. Every sound cut into her like a blade: the rustle of leaves in the cold wind, the scrape of boots against dirt, the hollow rhythm of a shovel biting into the earth. She flinched at each strike, the noise louder than it should have been, echoing in her ears like a grim announcement. Each shovelful of dirt tossed aside was another reminder of the grave being carved, the resting place prepared before her son had even taken his final breath. Evelyn's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she forced them back, as though holding them in might somehow hold back reality itself. Her helplessness was a torment greater than pain. She had always been his protector. From the first moment she held him, small and fragile, against her chest, she had sworn silently that she would never let the world break him. She remembered his first steps across the faded carpet of their living room, his laughter when he learned to ride his bike down the neighborhood street, his voice cracking awkwardly when adolescence had caught up with him too quickly. All those memories pulsed through her like a cruel slideshow, mocking her as she stood unable to move, unable to stop what was about to be taken from her. Michael turned his head toward her, his eyes wide with terror but filled with something deeper, something that twisted the knife inside her heart. Even in that moment, even as the shadows pressed in around him, he looked for her, his mother, as though she still held the power to save him. His gaze pleaded with her in silence, begging her to find the strength she no longer had, begging her to become the shield she had always been. Evelyn's chest tightened, her breath shattering into fragments as she met his eyes. She wanted to scream, to shout, to throw herself between him and fate, but her voice was locked inside her throat, strangled by the cruel hand of fear and the knowledge that even if she spoke, nothing would change. The figure with the shovel kept digging, his movements steady and deliberate, as though he had done this before. The sound of earth being split open mixed with the faint whimpers coming from Michael, creating a symphony of dread that Evelyn could never escape. Her nails dug into her palms until she felt the sting of skin breaking, but the pain grounded her in the unbearable present. She thought of running forward, of clawing at the ropes that bound her son, but a sharp glance from the figure froze her blood. There was power in that silence, a warning without words that if she moved, it would not just be her son who paid the price. Her heart pounded like a drum, loud and frantic, almost drowning out the shovel's rhythm. She remembered holding that same boy against her chest when he was an infant, feeling the tiny thump of his heart against her own. Back then, every beat had been a promise of life, a future waiting to unfold. Now, with each desperate beat of his heart, she felt the thread of his existence unraveling, slipping away while she stood powerless to grasp it. The night was cruel in its beauty. The moonlight glistened on the disturbed soil, silvering the edges of the grave as though mocking the sanctity of what it would soon hold. The wind carried faint sounds from the world beyond this nightmare: a dog barking in the distance, the low hum of a car passing far away, life continuing somewhere else while hers fractured in silence. Evelyn wanted to scream loud enough to reach those distant lives, to tear a hole in the calm night and drag the world into her horror, but the weight of her fear pressed her lips shut. Michael's breathing quickened, each inhale sharp and ragged, as though he could sense the nearness of the end. His chest rose and fell with frantic desperation, his small frame shuddering with sobs he tried to contain. Evelyn wanted to gather him into her arms, to press his head against her shoulder, the way she had when he was a child afraid of monsters under his bed. Now, the monster was real, and she could do nothing but watch as it towered over him. Her mind screamed with guilt, with rage, with helplessness. She thought of every moment she had ever failed him, every time she had been too tired to listen, every time she had scolded him too harshly, every moment she had assumed there would always be time to make it right. That time had been stolen from her, ripped away before her eyes. She would never again get to tell him how proud she was, never again get to hear his laughter fill their small home, never again get to hold him close and pretend the world could not touch them. The figure paused for a moment, resting on the shovel, and in that stillness Evelyn's heart seized. The grave yawned open in front of her, dark and waiting, its shadows stretching long across the ground like a silent predator. Michael's whimpers faltered into a breathless silence, his chest heaving as his eyes clung desperately to hers. Evelyn felt her soul tearing apart, every fiber of her being, screaming to act, to fight, to protect, but all she could do was stand frozen, forced to witness the breaking of the vow she had once whispered over his sleeping form, that she would always keep him safe. The shadowed figure loomed over the freshly torn earth, his movements calm, methodical, as though he had rehearsed this scene 100 times in silence. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, the rest swallowed in the darkness of night. Evelyn tried to memorize every detail she could see, the way his shoulders carried no hesitation, the slow, deliberate rhythm of his breath, the chilling steadiness in his posture. There was no urgency in him, no flicker of doubt, only the cold precision of someone who believed he had complete control. Evelyn's skin prickled as his gaze flicked toward her. That single glance carried more weight than 100 threats spoken aloud. She felt it press against her throat, squeezing tighter than the air she struggled to breathe. He hadn't bound her hands, hadn't gagged her mouth, but he didn't need to. His silence was a chain, his presence a prison. She knew if she tried to run, if she dared to speak, the consequence would come swift and merciless. His control didn't need words. It was written in the grave yawning open at their feet, in the unspoken promise that resistance would only bring more death. Michael whimpered softly, shifting against the ropes that cut into his wrists. His small body trembled with fear, and still, Evelyn saw the boy trying to summon courage, trying not to collapse into sobs. Her heart cracked at the sight. She wanted to tell him to stay still, to stay quiet, to do nothing that might spark the figure's anger, but she didn't dare speak. Even her voice, soft and trembling, might be enough to ignite the violence she feared. The figure lifted the shovel again, the metal glinting in the dim light, and Evelyn flinched. She remembered a time when the sound of metal on earth had meant safety gardens planted in spring. Michael's laughter as he helped dig little holes for tomato plants, dirt smudged across his cheeks. That same sound now carried death, every strike of steel into soil, an unspoken countdown. She bit down hard on her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to stay silent, forcing herself not to scream at the figure to stop. What struck her most wasn't his strength, but his composure. No hurried breaths, no trembling hands, no hesitation. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew Evelyn would obey his silence, who knew fear had locked her into place. And he was right. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to protect her son, but her muscles refused to move. It was as though he had hollowed her out and filled her with ice, leaving her alive, only to watch, to witness. She searched his face for some shred of humanity, something that might remind her he was flesh and blood and not a shadow come to life. But his eyes, when they met hers again, were empty, not rage-filled, not wild, but void, like a man who had buried whatever soul he once had long ago. That emptiness terrified her more than any flash of anger could have. A man who feels nothing cannot be swayed, cannot be bargained with, cannot be stopped. Evelyn's hands shook uncontrollably at her sides. She wanted to claw at the earth, to throw herself into the grave before it claimed her son, to do anything that would break the figure's unyielding calm. But her fear bound her as tightly as the ropes around Michael's wrists. She realized, with a sick twist in her stomach, that this was exactly what the figure wanted, to make her watch, to make her silence the final betrayal her son would see before the end. The grave deepened with each strike, shadows stretching inside it like dark veins. Michael's sobs grew quieter, his strength faltering, and Evelyn's vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back. The figure didn't look at the boy, didn't acknowledge his fear. His attention was fixed on the earth, on the task, on the ritual of destruction he carried out with terrifying patience. It was as if Michael's life wasn't even the point, it was Evelyn's helplessness, her silence, her torment, that gave meaning to this horror. And so she stood there, her body trembling, her lips pressed shut against the scream, clawing to escape, forced into obedience by nothing more than the shadow of the man who held her world in his hands. The sound of metal biting into the ground grew steady, relentless, a rhythm that beat against Evelyn's chest like a second heart. Each strike of the shovel tore into the earth with the certainty of inevitability, scattering clumps of dirt across the grass. The grave stretched wider, deeper, its dark mouth opening greedily, waiting. Evelyn's eyes locked on it, her stomach twisting into knots so tight she thought she might be sick. She had seen open graves before, but never like this, never one dug before the victim had even taken his last breath. It was punishment, a cruel theater of death, designed not just to end a life but to destroy hers in the process. Michael's muffled sobs carried on the wind, thin and trembling, each one a plea she couldn't answer. He shifted against the ropes binding him, his small frame jerking with panic, but the knots only cut deeper into his skin. Evelyn felt the urge to run forward, to throw herself between him and the abyss, yawning open at their feet. Yet her body refused to obey, trapped by fear, trapped by the silent threat radiating from the figure digging with merciless calm. She wanted to scream, to beg, to bargain, but the words tangled uselessly inside her chest, strangled before they ever touched the air. The soil grew darker as the hole deepened, moisture giving off a smell that clung to her throat and made her gag. It was the smell of finality, of endings, of a place where the living did not belong. Every new layer of dirt exposed was a reminder of what was coming, what she would be forced to see. She couldn't look away, though every fiber of her being begged her to close her eyes. It was as though the grave itself demanded her gaze, demanded she watch it take shape, demanded she understand its hunger. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to cling to anything that wasn't this moment. She thought of Michael's room back home, cluttered with old comic books and broken toys he refused to throw away. She thought of the posters peeling from his walls, of the sneakers he always left by the front door, of the smell of his hair when she hugged him after soccer practice. All of it felt impossibly distant, fading like a dream at dawn. Here, there was only the grave, the cold night air, and the sound of earth splitting open. Her heart throbbed painfully as she realized the cruel truth. The grave was being dug not just to bury Michael but to bury her hope. Every shovelful of dirt cast aside was another piece of her future stolen. She would never see him grow older, never hear the deeper timbre his voice would take, never watch him stumble awkwardly into adulthood. That hole wasn't just for him, it was swallowing everything she had lived for, everything that tethered her to life. The figure paused for only a moment, leaning on the shovel, and lifted his head to glance at her. His eyes were hollow, devoid of anything but purpose, and Evelyn shuddered. She knew then that this was never about efficiency, never about simply ending Michael's life. The grave was a stage. Its presence, open and waiting, was a sentence far worse than a sudden blow. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling of her soul, forcing her to watch the future crumble with every strike of steel into earth. Her knees weakened, trembling beneath her weight. But she refused to fall. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. Still, her body betrayed her in small ways. Her fingers clenched so tightly her nails drew blood. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her lips quivered with the words she didn't dare speak. She felt caged, like an animal forced to witness its young being dragged away. Powerless, silent, suffocating in despair. And all the while, the grave yawned wider, deeper, its shadow stretching toward her, whispering of what it was meant to hold. Michael's breathing faltered, each inhale sharp and uneven, like a boy drowning in fear. The ropes dug into his wrists and ankles, his skin raw from struggling, yet his fight was growing weaker. Evelyn could see the tremors in his shoulders, the way his chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, as though his body already sensed the nearness of the grave that waited for him. But it wasn't the panic that shattered her most, it was the way his eyes sought hers, desperate, pleading, clinging to her with a trust that cut her deeper than any knife. His gaze was not just fear, it was a question, a silent cry that asked, "Why aren't you saving me?" Evelyn's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. She wanted to shout back with everything inside her, to tell him she would tear the world apart to protect him, that this wasn't her choice, that she wasn't abandoning him. But she said nothing. She stood frozen, her silence louder than words, and she saw the way it broke him. That desperate glance carried the weight of betrayal. Though he never spoke the word, Evelyn remembered those same eyes when he was small, when they had been filled with innocence instead of terror. She remembered how he used to look at her when he needed comfort after nightmares, after skinned knees, after bullies on the playground. His eyes had always carried the same trust, the same unshakable belief that his mother could fix anything. Now those same eyes searched her face, begging for that same salvation, but she had none to give. The realization cracked her open, flooding her with a guilt so raw she could hardly stay upright. Michael's lips trembled, forming words he couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. She thought she saw the shape of Mom in the faint movement, and the sound of it in her head nearly broke her. She wanted to run forward, to throw herself at the figure's feet, to beg for mercy, to trade her life for his. But the shadow with the shovel didn't need chains to bind her. Fear alone anchored her in place. Evelyn's stillness became its own weapon, her inability to move the cruelest act of all. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she forced herself to keep her eyes locked on Michael's. She owed him that much, at least that he would not die unseen, that his last glance would not be met with a turned face. But that decision brought no comfort, only more agony, because in his wide, tear-streaked eyes, she could see the last flicker of hope extinguishing, replaced by the hollow understanding that his mother's love could not shield him this time. And when that final look passed between them, Evelyn felt something inside her fracture, beyond repair. It was as if the grave was already swallowing them both, even before the earth closed around him. The night pressed down heavier as Evelyn's mind reeled, haunted not only by the sight before her but by the memory of what had come before, things she had buried deep, things she had prayed would never resurface. The grave being carved into the earth was not just punishment for Michael, it was punishment for her, for the choices she had made years ago, for the secret she had carried in silence. Each strike of the shovel seemed to pull fragments of her past into the open, dragging the shadows she thought were long gone into the cold air around her. She remembered the man's face from years back, though she had tried to erase it from her memory. His eyes then had carried the same emptiness she saw now, the same merciless calculation. Evelyn had crossed paths with him once before, back when she was younger, desperate, and reckless in ways she never admitted to anyone. She had done things to survive, choices born of fear and necessity, choices that stained her conscience every day since. She had told herself those sins were buried, that her son would never be touched by the mistakes of her youth. But the grave, and the figure standing over it, were proof that the past was not buried at all. It had been waiting. Michael didn't know the truth. He had grown up in the safety of the lie she built around him, never suspecting the danger that stalked her shadow. And now, in this moment, Evelyn saw the cruel cost of her silence. The haunting secret that tied her to the man with the shovel was not hers alone anymore. It had reached across the years and wrapped itself around her son, dragging him into a fate he had never chosen. Her heart twisted as she recalled the promises she had made when Michael was born. She had whispered them into the dark hospital room, her hand brushing over his tiny chest, promising he would never know the hunger, the danger, the pain she had endured. She had built her entire life around that vow, working endless hours, enduring loneliness, and sacrificing everything for the fragile dream of a safe future for him. But she had lied. Not to him. He had believed her love fully, but to herself. She had believed she could outpace the past, bury it beneath years of silence. Now, as the grave deepened, Evelyn realized the truth. The man had never forgotten, and neither had the past. The secret she had sworn to guard, the one she thought she had hidden so well, was the very reason her son was on his knees tonight, staring at her with terrified eyes. And worse, she could not even speak it aloud. She couldn't warn him, couldn't explain, couldn't beg him to forgive her for the invisible chain that bound them to this moment. The night around her seemed to whisper her guilt, every gust of wind carrying the weight of her silence. She wanted to confess, to scream the truth into the darkness, to tell Michael why this was happening, why he was being dragged into a punishment meant for her. But the figure's presence kept her caged. She knew that if she spoke a single word of the past, his hand would not hesitate to silence her forever, and Michael would still be lost. The secret clung to her like a noose, tightening with each passing second. The grave wasn't just for Michael's body, it was for her soul, her promise, her motherhood. Evelyn realized then that she was watching not only her son's life being stolen but also the final unmasking of her own past, the debt she could never pay in silence alone. and though she had carried it for years, the weight of it had never felt heavier than in the moment her son's wide, fearful eyes silently begged her for an answer she could not give. The grave was finished, its dark edges swallowing the moonlight, a silent mouth gaping in the earth. Evelyn's breath came in ragged shivers, her body trembling as though she were standing on the edge herself. The figure rested on the shovel, his work complete, and turned his gaze toward her. For a long, harrowing moment, no sound filled the night, only the thudding of her heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in her ears. She knew what the grave meant. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a sentence, a curse that would cling to her long after the earth had settled over her son. Michael's sobs had grown faint, his strength nearly gone, but his eyes never left hers. That final glance burned into her like fire, branding her with the unbearable truth. She would live with this moment forever. She would live remembering the way he looked to her for salvation, the way her silence sealed his fate. The grave was not only his, it was hers too. A reminder carved into the soil that she had been forced to stand and do nothing while the world tore her child away. When the figure's shadow moved closer, Evelyn felt her knees give way, but she did not fall. She stood, trembling and hollow, forced to witness as the night claimed the boy she had once promised to protect. The grave yawned wide in front of her, and though it would soon be filled, she knew its darkness would never stop echoing inside her. It was a prison she would carry for the rest of her life, an open wound that no time could close.